The World Trade Center did not rise from empty ground. Some of what it replaced was pushed into the Hudson, brick, concrete, wood, and glass. The broken stockrooms and storefront walls of Radio Row used as landfill. The shoreline extended west. Battery Park City would later sit on that new ground. The towers were not only built over a neighborhood, they were built from its remains. Before the site became a plaza and a podium, it was solder smoke and stock drawers. Vacuum tubes in cardboard sleeves, spools of wire, delivery labels reading Cortland, Greenwich. Oscar Nadell's radio parts shop among hundreds like it. At the dedication, the microphones caught the polished language, Renewal commerce, a city reaching upward, and the district under the speakers was treated as if it had never existed. Begin with what the official story omitted. In the years after World War II, Lower Manhattan became an anxiety before it became a plan. Office buildings south of Chambers Street weren't suddenly worthless, but they were old and increasingly out of step with what large firms wanted. Midtown offered newer space and prestige addresses. Vacancies formed a slow pressure that public language could package as decline. That drift mattered to one particular circle because they had something to lose. David Rockefeller's office life ran through downtown. As an executive at Chase and a civic organizer, he moved between bank balance sheets, property interests, and the city's self-image. When downtown rents softened and corporate headquarters looked north, it wasn't only an urban planning concern, it was a threat to the way power had been mapped out in the city for decades. The response wasn't a single proposal, it was a vehicle. In 1956, Rockefeller helped organize the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association. On paper, it read like civic stewardship, a coalition with an interest in the public good. In practice, it concentrated the agenda of major property owners and financial institutions into a planning program. It could hire consultants, commission studies, and, most crucially, turn what a few wealthy men wanted into something the public was told it needed. The studies and statements that followed leaned on a consistent set of terms. Blocks were obsolete, streets were inefficient, the district lacked modern amenities. The remedy, therefore, couldn't be incremental repairs. It had to be a signature project large enough to pull gravity back downtown, an emblem with square footage attached. Then the numbers intrude. By the mid-1950s, Radio Row was not a dead zone waiting for rescue. Estimates put employment there at roughly 30,000 people with annual sales in the tens of millions. It was economically legible. It simply did not read as the kind of downtown the sponsors wanted to advertise. Yet there was a basic constraint that hung over every drawing. A private developer couldn't assemble 13 blocks cleanly, quickly, or cheaply. Not in Lower Manhattan, where titles were fragmented, leases were layered, and owners had no reason to sell at a price that made a speculative mega-project pencil out. Negotiation would be slow, litigation would be slow, and every delay would give opposition time to organize. This brings us to the mechanism that keeps showing up in the record. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, created as a bi-state agency for transportation and regional infrastructure, the Port Authority carried unusual capabilities. It could issue revenue bonds that didn't depend on city budgets. It could operate with exemptions from local zoning in ways ordinary developers couldn't. And it held condemnation power, eminent domain, when it could assert a public purpose. It also answered upward to the governors, more than outward to city voters. That governance structure mattered. A city council hears retail disruption and street-level politics. 2 governors and a bi-state board hear regional prestige, jobs, and institutional reach. The Port Authority functioned as a shield, insulated, financially elastic, and legally formidable. The Downtown Lower Manhattan Association didn't need to build. It needed to write the diagnosis, define the problem in terms that fit Port Authority action, and translate private preferences into public policy language. Site selection followed that pattern. The west side of Lower Manhattan, near the Hudson, offered proximity to Port Authority-run tunnels and a waterfront edge that could be remade. It also offered something else, a district of small businesses clustered in aging buildings, easy to describe as blight if the only metrics were building age and street congestion. Radio Row sat inside that logic. As a marketplace, it functioned. It attracted specialized customers. It was dense, informal, and profitable enough to persist. But it didn't match the image that planners and financiers wanted the city to project. And it didn't command the rents that would justify modern office towers. A private circle defines downtown as a problem. It builds a planning association to formalize the diagnosis. It identifies a project too large for private assembly. The Port Authority supplies bonds, insulation, and eminent domain. The remaining task is rhetorical as much as legal. Make public purpose wide enough to cover a commercial complex. Once that definition holds, the rest becomes administration. Board votes, minutes, appraisals. For the shopkeepers on Cortlandt and Greenwich, the first sign wouldn't be a letter, it would be a headline. The headline moment arrived as if it had always been scheduled. A joint announcement, architectural renderings, a price tag. The tone wasn't exploratory, it was declarative. The World Trade Center was presented as a remedy for drift, with the Port Authority positioned as the proper instrument to deliver it. The press accounts leaned into that framing. Modernization, regional competitiveness, thousands of jobs, a global marketplace given physical form. When the existing district appeared, it did so in compressed form. A number of shops, a few sentences about relocation, then back to the towers. In the coverage, Radio Row functioned as an inconvenience. Merchants disputed the minimization immediately because their argument wasn't abstract. It was concrete. Customers came there because the shops were together. A parts supplier could send a buyer 2 doors down for a component. A repairman could walk a block to find a tube the same afternoon. That clustering was the business. Break the cluster and you didn't relocate a store. You dissolved the logic that made the store viable. So they organized the way small businesses usually do when the opponent is too large for individual resistance. Trade groups pooled money, owners chose spokespeople, lawyers were hired to test the one place where the project still had to speak precisely, the standard for eminent domain. The legal question wasn't whether government could take property. That power was established. The question was whether this taking fit within the boundary of public use and whether the Port Authority, created for transportation and port commerce, could condemn a commercial district for an office complex. The Port Authority's answer was strategic. It didn't defend the project as a real estate venture. It defended it as infrastructure for international trade, a public facility, a regional necessity. The language mattered. If the World Trade Center could be described as an instrument of trade, like a port, a terminal, a bridge, then condemnation became a tool of policy rather than a tool of development. This brings us to a detail that is often mentioned but rarely examined. Blight. The word did most of the work. What was measured were visible traits that read as old. Building age, crowded streets, outdated systems. What received less weight was functionality, foot traffic, profitability, and the density of specialized work that existed precisely because rents stayed low. Blight became a bridge between description and permission. Label the district deficient, therefore clear it. Therefore rebuild it as a public good. The merchants took the fight to court because court filings force a project to define itself. They sought an injunction. They challenged whether the Port Authority's purpose could stretch to include a massive office development. They argued that the benefit flowed, in reality, to private tenants who would rent the space and to interests invested in downtown land values. For a shop owner, the issue was less constitutional than personal. If the taking was public, then why did the outcome look like private office space? Oscar Nadel's question, reduced to its essential form, was simple. What public purpose requires dismantling a functioning district and calling it improvement? The higher courts took the side of the Port Authority. The judges agreed that a trade center was a good enough reason to take the land. They deferred to the agency's declared mission and the legislative language around it. Once judges treat purpose as something an authority can assert and boards can ratify, the merchants lose the ground where argument has leverage. Inside the Port Authority, the project moved through minutes, approvals, and sequencing decisions that read procedural. The effect was decisive. Votes turned uncertainty into obligation. Timelines compressed negotiation. Speed became a tactic. After the ruling, the conflict stopped being philosophical and became procedural. And procedure is where power usually wins. Once the courts cleared the path, the Port Authority didn't need to persuade anyone. It needed to process them. Condemnation turns a neighborhood into a timetable. Appraisers arrive with clipboards and formulas. Values get assigned to parcels and fixtures. Deadlines get mailed. The story stops being debated and starts being executed. For many Radio Row merchants, the first shock was how narrow loss became. The law required compensation, but the categories were limited: space, inventory, lease terms. What made the district work, habit, trust, clustering, didn't fit the sheet. The value of a shop's reputation wasn't treated like something worth paying for. The planners acted like a business could just start over anywhere. It didn't. A shop could relocate and still fail because the address wasn't the point. The ecosystem was. Once the businesses scattered, the network could not be reassembled door by door. The forced timelines made those decisions sharper. Some owners took settlements early because delay didn't change the outcome. Others resisted because resistance was the only leverage left. For older proprietors, the timing mattered as much as the money. Employees sat even further outside the process. Condemnations focused on owners and tenants. The people who worked the counters, did the repairs, handled deliveries, often had no claim at all. By the time demolition arrived, Radio Row wasn't a single event. It was a sequence. Blocks cleared in stages, streets fenced off, piles of brick and splintered lumber replacing addresses that had been printed on invoices for decades. Holdouts were handled through court orders and marshals. The last days were rarely cinematic. They were logistical. A few hours to remove what could be carried. The rest left behind because there was no space, no time, and no buyer. As the storefronts disappeared, the media posture shifted again. The legal conflict had produced clear protagonists. The construction story didn't need them. Engineering updates replaced eviction notices. The Port Authority's language held steady. Progress, renewal, trade. Radio Row's name didn't fit that vocabulary, so it dropped out of it. Then came a disposal decision that locked the erasure into the landscape. The rubble had to go somewhere. Hauling it away cost time and money. So much of it was moved into the Hudson, used as fill along the river's edge. A commercial district became landfill, not as metaphor, as physical fact. Material that had once been walls, floors, shelves, and workshops was pushed outward to create new ground. In the aftermath, what remains in the record is uneven. Court documents capture the arguments. Port Authority minutes. Record votes and sequencing in the calm tone of administration. Newspapers show how quickly a functioning district can be reframed as a cleared site. But there is no comprehensive official archive of what was lost. The neighborhood didn't only get demolished, it was unfiled. A neighborhood can vanish without a scandal when law, finance, and narrative move in the same direction, and nobody is tasked with remembering the displaced. If you value historical inquiry that follows filings and minutes instead of myths, subscribe and continue exploring the gaps between official narratives and the physical record.